Hello and welcome to today's Middle East report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the new agreement reached between the Western powers and Iran over its nuclear weapons program, and asking, have our leaders prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons, or is it peace in our time? Professor Alan Johnson from BICOM, it's great to have you back on the Middle East report again. Can you share with our viewers how you've been since you last on the programme and some of the activities and programmes you've been doing on behalf of Israel in the last few months?
Well, it's been a very busy time. I spoke to the Cambridge Union in a debate, and we won the debate, which was the ongoing value of the two-state solution. I went to the European Parliament and lobbied there for Israel. And our usual activities with the media and with the Foreign Office and with politicians and opinion formers in the UK.
Fantastic. And in today's programme, really discussing this new agreement's been reached by the P5+1, which are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, and Iran over Iran's nuclear weapons programme. What do you make of this agreement that was announced on Sunday night?
Well, the first thing to say about it is that it's an interim agreement. It's to last 6 months, with the idea that there will be a permanent, comprehensive settlement of the issues at the end of the 6 months. We'll have to see if that turns out to be the case. There's some elements of the deal which you could say are positive. There's a statement by Iran it will not pursue a nuclear weapon, which, even though it's a statement, it's good to have. At one level, it's simply good to have Iran shaking hands with the so-called Great Satan. That's a positive development to see. It takes us away from conflict and war. And there's a pause button being pressed over its nuclear program. So 20% enrichment at 20% is dangerous. It's not a big step from that level of enrichment to the bomb. That kind of enrichment has been stopped and rolled back. It will have to be converted to either low enriched uranium or oxide form. Any continuing enrichment will be at a very low level of 3 to 5%. A lot of the advanced centrifuges that Iran has won't be allowed to be operated, at least for the next 6 months. And there's a very invasive inspections regime with cameras, 24-hour cameras, and some of the key sites and so on. All of that on the surface is positive. However, the jubilant scenes in Iran are interesting. The fact that the Hezbollah leader has said it's a great victory for Iran should be interesting to us, and that the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has said it's a great victory for Iran, also should tell us we need to be concerned about the deal. I think there's a couple of great big problems with it. One is it in effect acknowledges Iran's right to enrich uranium. That goes directly counter to a series of UN Security Council resolutions. That's a real problem. Secondly, it punches a hole inside the sanctions regime, which is what brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. Once that hole's been punched in, which it has, it gives Iran somewhere between $7 billion of relief, and some people say maybe up to $20 billion of relief over the course of the 6 months. It could be that that hole gets bigger and bigger, Iran whittles it away, businesses rush in to try and do business with Iran. It's very hard to reconstruct a painfully put together sanctions regime, and that was the main leverage that we had over Iran. Everything Iran is doing is completely reversible, including taking its 20% enriched uranium down to 3.5. It can reconvert that back up to 20% relatively easily. Not a single centrifuge has been destroyed. Not a single facility has been destroyed. The weapons component of the program hasn't even been looked at in the deal. So there's a series of problems with the deal. It's very worrying.
And we've got a news clip to go to now that announces this new interim agreement between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the P5+1 nations of the UN Security Council.
Foreign leaders are buzzing after the announcement in Geneva early Sunday morning that the P5+1 powers got Iran to agree to scale back part of its nuclear program in exchange for limited sanctions relief. Some have called it an historic agreement, but for Israel, Iran's longtime foe, it's something quite different.
What was achieved last night in Geneva is not a historic agreement. It is a historic mistake. Today the world has become a much more dangerous place because the most dangerous regime in the world has taken a significant step towards obtaining the most dangerous weapon in the world.
Netanyahu went on to say that his government is not bound by the deal and that Israel cannot rule out the option of a military strike against Iran to stop it from obtaining an atomic bomb. Iran has promised to stop enriching uranium beyond 5% and in return gets sanctions relief to the tune of about $7 billion.
Well, the deal is very, very convenient for Iran, not that convenient for Israel. I think that the bottom line is that Iran got kind of an approval to enrich uranium, and for them, removing some of the sanctions, this could be definitely interpreted as kind of a partial, if not a complete victory.
Meanwhile, in Iran, President Hassan Rouhani appeared on national television and praised the deal, saying it recognizes Iran's nuclear right and allows his country to continue to enrich uranium. His foreign minister, who was at the meeting in Geneva, added that the deal shows, quote, all plots hatched by the Zionist regime to stop the nuclear agreement have failed. Israel is upset because it wanted Iran to stop all nuclear enrichment, but U.S. President Barack Obama sought to ease concerns in Israel, saying, if Iran fails to keep its commitment, we will turn off the relief and ratchet up the pressure. On the streets of Tel Aviv, reaction to the deal was not overly positive.
It reminds me of the agreement Chamberlain made, the famous Munich agreement, when he thought he was saving the world from World War II.
I feel that the Americans maybe hurt a little bit Israel, but we should wait and see.
Israeli President Shimon Peres said only time will tell whether the Iranians adhere to the terms of the deal and urged the Islamic Republic to reject terrorism and stop their nuclear program.
And Alan, according to my notes here, it says that Iran has agreed to halt uranium enrichment beyond 5% purity, the level which could be used for weapons research, and diluting its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium, which is closer to weapons grade. Iran will also give access to its nuclear sites to the International Atomic Energy Agency. But what alarms me the most about this agreement is it doesn't stop Iran from becoming a nuclear military power.
That's true. It may be worth, this is quite a technical discussion, so for your viewers, really there's three components to a nuclear weapon. You have to create enough enriched uranium to stuff into a warhead, then you have to mount that warhead on a delivery system. Iran's been making great progress in all three components: the enriched uranium, weaponization in a warhead, and the delivery system. It has intercontinental ballistic missiles, which it's developing. It's launched 2 satellites. That program is advancing. It has, we know from the International Atomic Energy Authority in 2011 in its report, it said there was evidence of weaponization research and elements of the program that had no explanation outside of a framework of weapons development. On the enriched uranium side of things, there's 2 ways to look at the deal. One is that Iran has stopped its march towards having enough uranium to make that bomb. The second way to look at the deal is that if you think of it as a film, Iran's been developing this program since the 1980s. If you think of this as a movie, it's 5 minutes to go in the movie, and Iran's agreed to press the pause button for 2 minutes. That's not a bad deal for Iran if that's what's happening. So at the end of the 6 months, if they then are still in possession of all of their centrifuges, which produce the enriched uranium, and all of the stockpile of uranium which they've got about enough for 7 to 8 bombs worth at 5%. And they've got the capacity to take that 5% to 20%. If there's no comprehensive deal at the end of 6 months, then Iran is in effect a threshold state. a threshold nuclear state, which means it's on the edge of having the capacity to build the bomb. And that's the concern, not only of Israel, by the way, but also of the Gulf states, of Saudi Arabia, and of many others around the world.
Absolutely. But surely, probably the biggest question the international community should be asking is why does Iran need nuclear energy when she's the fourth largest exporter of oil and natural gas in the world, and has incredible rich oil reserves and energy reserves that could be used instead. But it seems very much that Iran is intent on building atomic weapons. And we know with the regime that it wants to destroy the state of Israel and wants to control and dominate the entire Middle East, and also preserve the regime. Because if we look at China's, for example, it's because of China's nuclear weapons that the West couldn't come to the aid of China's human rights demonstrators in '89 because of a fear of a nuclear backlash.
You're absolutely right. If Iran's claim is that it is developing a civil nuclear energy program, so as you say, the immediate question is, why do you need that? You're sitting on a sea of oil and gas reserves, amongst the largest in the world, as you say. So the international community next said, well, okay, if it's a civil program you want, it was offered deals recently whereby we can do the conversion for you out of the country. Any requirements you have for medical research, Russia in particular volunteered to do that. That was turned down too. Elements of its program, including some of its nuclear facilities, only really have any logic to them being built, and being built deep underground, immunized from military attack if they're part of a nuclear weapons program. Now, the concern that the international community has and should continue to have, it's the combination really of the weapon, the regime, and its ideology. The weapon is a weapon of mass destruction. The regime is a brutal theocracy which has murdered its own people in great numbers, and which has regional ambitions to dominate the Gulf states and to create a Shia crescent across the region which will dominate that area. Its ideology is one in which, you know, it's messianic, it's extreme, it's anti-Western, it's viciously anti-Semitic. And you put this package together of the weapon, the regime, and the ideology, and it's reasonable for states in the region to be very concerned about the deal that was struck, and to hope that the final deal is a lot tougher than this and creates the real objective, which should be the dismantlement, the verifiable dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program.
Absolutely. And we've got a news clip now that looks at why this issue is so important, explains a lot of the science behind Iran's nuclear weapons program.
Iran has agreed to curb its nuclear program for the next 6 months in exchange for limited sanctions relief. Uranium found in nature is made up of 2 isotopes or chemical elements. 99.3% is uranium-238 and less than 1% uranium-235, used to produce nuclear energy. To increase the percentage of uranium-235, centrifuges are used in a process known as enrichment. Rotating cylinders separate the uranium-238 molecules from the lighter 235. Many centrifuges are needed to obtain a significant amount of usable uranium. To generate power, uranium-235 must be enriched to 5%. Uranium enriched to 90%, however, can be used to make a nuclear weapon. Under the interim deal, Tehran will neutralize its stockpile of uranium enriched to 20% and halt enrichment of uranium above 5%. UN atomic inspectors will have daily access to the Fordo and Natanz enrichment facilities. Iran says it won't make any further advances at the 2 sites, nor at its Arak heavy water reactor.
That clip there should go a long way to explaining Iran's nuclear weapons program and why it's so important that the Western powers prevent Iran from actually achieving nuclear weapons. Now, in terms of this new interim agreement, which is an interim agreement for 6 months, and after 6 months, the US and the P5+1 nations also then want to create a permanent deal on Iran's nuclear weapons program. But what they get in return these 6 months is astonishing. It says they have some relief on sanctions applied to petrochemicals, gold and other precious metals. The international powers release some around 4 billion of oil revenues that has been frozen in foreign banks. Why is the West doing this now when the Iranian regime is on the verge of economic collapse, and it's almost as if we've given them a lifeline to actually, so the regime can actually survive, and also the more damaging thing, allow them to continue with their nuclear weapons program.
It's a good question, because as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, this is like a boxer on the ropes. And the knockout blow could have been delivered, and we could have got a much stronger deal than this, and it simply wasn't. We've let Iran off the hook, so to speak. And that's a real problem for the international community. And what's going to happen next, I think, is that Iran is back in the community of nations. This is the other... you showed some of the scenes before. The sight of an Iranian foreign minister laughing and smiling and shaking hands with the world's leaders is significant for Iran. It's a great diplomatic victory for Iran. Why the West has done it, I think, there's a couple of reasons we could look at. One, I think there's a real war weariness after Iraq and Afghanistan, not just amongst the political elites, but amongst the peoples as well. I think President Obama backed away from the strikes on Syria after the chemical weapons attack in Syria, in part because he didn't feel there was a lot of support amongst the American people for that. That's significant. I think also there's a hope that, and we might say it's wishful thinking, but there is a genuine hope that the region can be stabilized around a long-term deal between Iran, Russia, America, and the EU. I mean, I think some American policymakers see that future ahead of them. Now, whether that's wishful thinking or not, and whether it's the historic mistake that Benjamin Netanyahu talked about, we will see play out over the next 6 months to a year.
What troubles me the most with this agreement is particularly that the Western powers could have said that Iran must halt its entire uranium enrichment program, and actually frozen its whole nuclear weapons program, as well as stopping its support for international terrorism and its support for Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And yet there doesn't seem to be any moral imperative with this agreement, not looking at the ideology of the regime, statements made by Iran's supreme leader that calls for the destruction of the State of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide, and like you said earlier, the establishment of a Shia crescent dominating the Middle East.
That's right. I was talking to a friend of mine, Ladan Burahmand, who runs a Iranian human rights website, OMID, and I asked her what she thought of the deal. And she said, well, you know, people will talk about the uranium enrichment and the technical aspects of the deal. From her point of view, she said, this is going to make it very difficult to stand up for human rights in Iran. Again, those handshakes, those smiles, the commitment that's now been made to Iran over a long period of time, I think they'll have relative impunity to continue with human rights abuses in the country. For example, even during the time when Prime Minister Rouhani, the smiling Rouhani who everyone's fallen in love with, was in New York having the initial discussions around the deal, I think 30 Iranians were hung, killed without due process by the regime. This time, in Geneva, as the P5+1 are making the deal with Iran, the Iranian supreme leader, and as people say, the clue is in the title as to who really runs Iran, the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, made a statement about Israel, and he said, Israelis are, and I quote, not to be thought of as human beings. He said they are, quote, rabid dogs, and he said, quote, Israel should be annihilated. And Israel's concern was that, and this is again the dynamic, you say, once you bring people into negotiations and you strike deals with them, this is the dynamic. The reaction was very, very quiet from the international community to those remarks. John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, said something along the lines of, it was unhelpful. And he said, we don't need at this stage in the negotiations people batting names back and forward, as if he was dealing with two squabbling children. And I think your point is the right one, which is that there's a kind of, in terms of the moral clarity we need in the West, faced with the Iranian regime, it's going to be very hard to retain that kind of moral clarity whilst we're seeking partnership with the Iranian regime.
And isn't this agreement really a masterstroke for the Iranian regime and the diplomatic skills of the new president, Rouhani, in comparison to his predecessor, Ahmadinejad? And really the West has fallen for his charm and deception, hook, line and sinker.
This is true. Some people used to say, you know, from Israel's point of view, there was a certain value to having Ahmadinejad in place. This was a man who openly denied the Holocaust and called for Israel to be wiped off the map. And he made these statements publicly. So it was a factor in building up a strong international consensus to apply very tough sanctions to Iran. Rouhani is a very different character. In 2003, Rouhani led the negotiations with Europe. Now, couple of interesting things about those negotiations. During the negotiations, as Rouhani later wrote in a book and bragged about openly, while we were talking in Europe, we were building in Isfahan. Isfahan's a place where they built a facility. So, and Rouhani pitched himself to the Iranian people in the recent elections, which he was victorious in, by saying, I can do two things at once for you. I can get rid of the sanctions and keep the nuclear program on track. I can do it with more subtlety than Ahmadinejad, more cleverly. We'll get to the same objective. And that's really Rouhani's objective, is to, and it's always been the Iranian objective, is to take its time. This is a long developing program from the 1980s to reach the goal with the least possible cost to Iran itself. And I think what we're seeing at the moment with the Rouhani charm offensive is very much part of that long-term strategic thinking of approaching a nuclear weapons capacity with the least possible damage to the Iranian regime.
And what's been the reaction in Israel? Because I know the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sees that Iran is the biggest foreign policy challenge to the state of Israel, and it considers Iran an existential threat. Now, if Iran does develop nuclear weapons, then what we will see then is an increase and support for international terrorism against Israel and the allies of the West around the world. Why is the West sort of like isolating Israel and also Saudi Arabia, two of the most strongest powers in the Middle East?
Yeah, a lot of the commentary in the UK, in the media, presents this as Israel against Iran, or Israel's the only objector to this deal. It's really not true. The Gulf states are alarmed by what's happening. They fear Iranian aspirations to dominate them and dominate the region. The Saudis are also very worried. Now, one of the worries we should all have about an Iranian nuclear weapon, should they acquire one, is that one of the dynamics it will touch off immediately is a nuclear arms race in the region. Saudi Arabia has said it will have no alternative but to pursue a nuclear weapon. It's openly said it's going to try and get one off the peg, so to speak, from Pakistan. Two other countries which will immediately begin, I think, research and put themselves on the track would be Egypt and Turkey. So in a region which already has a fracture line running down, and Sunni and Shia on two sides of that line engaged in conflict with each other, and wherever wherever the two forces meet, we see bloodshed and ethnic conflict and strife. To weaponize that conflict in the middle of the Middle East, with Saudi leading the Sunni bloc and Iran leading the Shia bloc, is a nightmare scenario, frankly.
And we've got a news clip now. This is taken from a press conference held by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, warning about this new interim deal and what it means for Israel and the world.
What was concluded in Geneva last night is not a historic agreement. It's a historic mistake. It's not made the world a safer place. Like the agreement with North Korea in 2005, this agreement has made the world a much more dangerous place. I know that many share the concern of Israel, especially in the region, and there's a reason for this. For years, the international community has demanded that Iran cease all uranium enrichment. Now, for the first time, the international community has formally consented that Iran continue its enrichment of uranium. And this is in direct contravention of UN Security Council resolutions. Iran is taking only cosmetic steps, which it could reverse easily within a few weeks. And in return, sanctions that took years to put in place are going to be eased. Iran is going to receive billions of dollars worth in sanctions relief. So the pressures on Iran are being lifted, they're being eased. And with the lifting of this pressure, this first step could very well be the last step. Without continued pressure, what incentive does the Iranian regime have to take serious steps that actually dismantle its nuclear weapons capability? Why would it dismantle the centrifuges and the plutonium reactor? None of this is covered in the agreement. They're left intact. So Israel is not bound by this agreement. We cannot and will not allow a regime that calls for the destruction of Israel to obtain the means to achieve this goal. We will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapons capability. Israel has many friends and allies, but when they're mistaken, it's my obligation to speak out clearly and openly and say so. It's my solemn responsibility to protect and defend the one and only Jewish state.
It's sad to think that the Israeli Prime Minister is the only Western leader with any sense of moral clarity and really understands the world between good and evil. Alan, we just saw there the Israeli Prime Minister at this press conference, very, very concerned about this new interim agreement. But really, what does it say about the special relationship between the United States and Israel when the French knew 6 months before this agreement was announced there were secret talks going on between the regime and the United States? And what does this really say about the state of relations between Israel and America?
Yes, it seems what we know now is that the American administration, with Obama using his close confidant, Valerie Jarrett, who's Iranian-born, to negotiate over the 9-month period with Iranian partners, it looks like the deal we've seen signed was put together in its basic shape during those negotiations. And it was presented as something of a fait accompli to the P5+1 by America and Iran recently. That's a problem for a couple of reasons. One is that America said it would always, one of the reasons it said to Israel, don't strike. We appreciate your concern about this emerging Iranian program. This is a country which has threatened you with destruction, which denies the Holocaust, which breathes fierce anti-Semitism towards you. We understand you feel you should strike. You may need to strike. Don't do that, because we will coordinate with you completely, and we will share plans with you, and you can rely on us. As Barack Obama said when he went to Israel this year, we have your back. He spoke to a large audience in Jerusalem and said, we have your back. And there's some concern that these negotiations took place without not just the knowledge of Israel, but also the knowledge of some of the European partners as well. The alliance is still completely intact. There's still, immediately after the negotiation was signed, there was a phone call between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and President Obama said, we want your input immediately as to how we make this a strong deal over the course of the next 6 months. We've seen military and security cooperation of an unprecedentedly close kind between America and Israel. President Obama's visit was a great success. He gave, I thought, a very Zionist speech in which he acknowledged fully Israel's not just right to exist, but the importance of it as a Jewish state, a specifically Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, which America would fully support. So by no means is the alliance threatened. This is a very difficult moment for it. I think there is a divergence in judgments at the moment about the Iranian regime and its trustworthiness and the value of bringing it into negotiations. But the basic relationship itself, I feel, is still very much intact.
And doesn't Israel now have a major problem on their hands? And that problem is that really that Israel has been the one that's been internationally isolated through the election of President Rouhani, as the world's embraced this new Iranian president, believing he's a force of peace and moderation. And in a sense that if now the Israelis decide to carry out airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, this would pose a major, major problem for Israel, because Israel will be internationally isolated. So what are Israel's options in terms of preventing Iran's nuclear weapons program?
I think you're right to say that there's no real option for Israel over the course of the next 6 months. Of course, we don't know how events will develop. It could well be that Israel has intelligence that means it simply has to strike. That's unlikely, and I think much more likely is that Israel will now sit and wait to see the 6 months play itself out. On the other hand, we should remember that this deal isn't all plain sailing for Iran either. Iran has now committed itself publicly to the global audience not to develop a nuclear weapons program, to engage in negotiations with the international community. If it simply uses the 6 months to bide its time and then pushes ahead with the nuclear program, then all bets are off in that regard, and the international community will then have to decide what to do next. And what it may decide to do next is that it has no alternative but a military option. The reason Iran is at the table at the moment is the combination of very, very tough sanctions, and a serious military option being on the table is what brought it to this point. One of the frustrations with the deal that's been struck is that almost both of those leverage points have been taken away. There's no real military option now because we've entered into the 6-month period, and the sanctions relief has meant that the sanctions regime is in danger of disintegrating. So that's a real problem.
It's a very good editorial on the Times on Monday, which is titled "A Bad Agreement: Sanctions, Diplomatic Pressure Forced Iran to Negotiate on its Nuclear Program. Geneva deal does little to restrain it from realizing its ambitions." And this is what I'm going to read from here. It says that this would be a valuable deal if it were concluded with a state that showed genuine willingness to accept its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It might then be the first step towards a more comprehensive deal that brought Iran back into the family of nations while providing guarantees of its energy supplies. Unfortunately, tragically, Iran is not that sort of actor in international affairs. The provision of the Geneva Agreement confer benefits on a state that has a long history of deceit, duplicity, bellicosity, xenophobia. Iran threatens Israel, a member state of the UN, with its extinction. Since its accelerated nuclear program in the late 1990s, Iran has been caught in a series of lies, has conducted illicit facilities such as the uranium enrichment plant at Natanz and heavy water plant at Arak. That makes little sense for a civil program, but are consistent with a wish to build nuclear weapons. And isn't that a problem that the West face in this agreement, is how can we trust the Iranians when the whole operation has been about deceit and deception?
Absolutely. This is not a normal regime. This is what people have to understand. It's one thing negotiating with a partner where there's some trustworthiness, and that's not the case here. To give one example to your viewers of the character of the regime, during the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq mined a lot of fields to try and stop the Iranians attacking them. The Iranian response to that was to send boys running across those fields, and what they had in their hands, given to them by the regime, was a plastic key. And they were told, this plastic key will see you into heaven. They ordered them en masse from the West, from toy suppliers. Tens of thousands of plastic keys were imported so they could be handed to boys, and those boys ran across the fields and set the mines off. That's how much this regime values human life. So it's a dishonest regime which has been caught again and again in contravention of all its commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to UN resolutions. It's a regime which breathes fierce anti-Semitism of a very unusual kind, the kind that it's not over the top to compare to a Nazi-like form of anti-Semitism. When Khomeini says they can't be thought of as human beings, that rendering of Jews into animals, that's straight out of the Goebbels and Himmler textbook of how you dehumanize people to prepare for their genocide. So it's not a normal regime. It's not a regime that has done anything to earn the trust of the world. So what we need to do now, because this deal has happened, is absolutely be on our guard and say to ourselves, we're going to use the next 6 months so that this really does lead to the verifiable dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program. And I think, all people who look for peace, not just friends of Israel, but all people who want to see peace in the world and want to see this region stay without weapons of mass destruction, will commit themselves to that over the next 6 months.
Alan, what are the implications, really? I mean, I've discussed this on various programs, but I think it's very important to go over this. What are the implications of Iran actually achieving and becoming a military power and having nuclear weapons at her disposal? Well, first of all, one thing to say is Ehud Barak, used to be Israel's prime minister and minister of defense, most decorated soldier. Ehud Barak said it will take one Iranian bomb to end the Zionist story. And that's maybe the thing to headline first of all. From Israel's point of view, at least, it could take one bomb to end the Zionist story. We're talking about a very small strip of land. That's
Israel's main problem. The region's main problem, as I've said, is it will touch off a nuclear arms race in the region, and that not in a context of political stability, but in a context of a regime which is roiling in revolution, ethnic strife, sectarian and religious conflict, massacres, genocide. There's virtually not a stable country in that region. For that region to engage in a nuclear arms race at this point is a nightmare scenario. Another problem will be that Iran has proxies, forces which act on its behalf or at its behest around the region, certainly. Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also some of the terrorist forces in the Gaza Strip. But also it has launched attacks on European soil. So the killing of Israeli tourists in Bulgaria was at Iran's organization. The attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador in Washington at Iran's instigation. The massacre of Jews in the community center in Argentina, Iranian organized terrorism. So we will see a protective umbrella spread over these terrorist proxy forces of Iran. It's very hard to take on these forces at the best of times. To try to take them on when their main sponsor is now a nuclear state will make it even more difficult. So a series of these dynamics could play out if Iran manages to acquire the bomb. Apart from the obvious, which is that Iran will be positioned to dominate the region, and the region remains the region which supplies a large amount of the world's energy needs. So that chokehold that a nuclear-armed Iran would have over the world's energy supply would also play itself out, not simply in economic terms, but in political terms too. The leverage, political leverage Iran would have with that kind of economic power would enable it to pursue some of its regional ambitions.
And let's take a scenario. 6 months' time. What does the future hold for a comprehensive agreement with Iran, and can the Western powers prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and reassure Israel that she's going to be okay?
Well, being positive, I think one thing we can say is it is true that this is partial and limited sanctions relief. The bulk of the sanctions program remains in place. Yes, our fear is that a hole's been punched in the dam, if you like, and there's a danger that that will widen. That's true. Nonetheless, in terms of the oil revenues, the oil sanctions and the banking sanctions, they're still basically in place. Iran is really hurting because of these sanctions. That's why it's come to the table. It's still the case, if that sanctions regime can be preserved, if a very invasive regime of inspection, and we do have a more invasive regime now, that also is positive. We have cameras where we didn't have them before. We have inspectors who can turn up without notification, whereas before they had to notify. This is if we can use that inspection regime, if we can use the remaining sanctions and the diplomatic might. And it is a diplomatic might. If you can get the P5+1 acting in concert in a rigorous way, demanding that Iran now moves forward towards dismantling its nuclear program, then there's some cause for optimism. It's important now that there's no backsliding on the sanctions regime or the inspections regime, and that we keep the pressure up on the Iranian regime to say, you have this 6-month period. We now want to move immediately to tough negotiations around dismantling this nuclear program. Now, whether or not those negotiations end up completely removing Iran's right to enrich, or whether they leave it with a token right to enrich to 5%, that will be something that comes up in the negotiations itself. Some commentators say Iran will need to get itself off the hook with its own public, in terms of having built itself up as we're standing against the West. It may need some fig leaf to preserve. It may be that in a tough negotiation you could give something like that. But that's very different than saying, carry on with your program. We need to be tough.
And what do you make of the news this week as well, that the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, has carried out its largest manoeuvres in its history, together with forces from Italy, the United States and Greece? Does that send a message to the Iranian regime?
I think it does. It certainly should do. Israel is not isolated. diplomatically or militarily or politically. It simply isn't. It has very strong and very powerful allies. It has itself a very powerful military and the Israeli Defense Forces. And these kinds of exercises, coordinated with Europe, coordinated with America, give a very strong signal that this is not a pariah state, this is not an isolated state, this is a UN member and a member with very strong alliances with the most powerful democracies in the world.
We've got a news clip now that is entitled "Israel hosts the largest ever joint military exercises," called Fighter Jet Squadrons from the US, Greece and Italy.
How do you find the food?
We live in a tough world, a dangerous world. Israel lives in a dangerous neighborhood, and we need the best equipped, best trained forces as possible to protect our people and our security. We also need allies, and we have great allies here.
Thank you very much.
It's a very good opportunity for us to continue to work on efficiencies, to become more logistically sound, to get all of our forces from point A to point B, and then how to actually operate together to continue to provide stability within the region. We really appreciate the opportunity.
As you can see from that clip, that Israel has one of the best air forces in the world and certainly has the capacity to actually defend itself and her people. Alan, we've got down to the last 8 minutes left of the programme, really, and many social commentators have compared this new interim agreement, they call it the Geneva Agreement, with that of the Munich Agreement that Neville Chamberlain signed in 1938. Is this not a fact that the West has lost its moral awareness, its moral clarity, its moral edge in confronting evil?
Well, it might seem a dramatic comparison to make. I've actually seen some commentators argue that Munich was better than this deal. And what they argue is that Munich was a kind of, at one level, it was a knowing agreement, and it gave the Western powers, who frankly didn't have the military might to stand up to Germany at that point, it gave them 9 months or so to rearm, and they used that 9 months to rearm. So there was a kind of knowingness to it. The concern some people have about this agreement is that there's a kind of unknowingness to it, that there's a real faith in an Iranian regime which doesn't really warrant that faith. Now, to be fair to those who negotiated it, they say, no, we're not stupid people, we understand the regime's nature, but we want to give diplomacy its chance. And what we've done with this is to pause the program, to give a 6-month window so that Iran can prove its bona fides, so to speak. It can prove that it's a partner that we can negotiate with. The gamble is that the 6 months can be used to that effect. Those who worry about the deal say the 6 months will be used by Iran to whittle away the sanctions program, whittle away the diplomatic nerve of the international community, and create a new reality in which it's able to coast towards a nuclear weapon. We'll have to say one of the things that's happening in America of note, on the side of those people who say we shouldn't trust, is new sanctions, not to actually happen now, but new sanctions which will come into effect if Iran doesn't hold up its side of the bargain, are being proposed by Senators Kirk, who's a Republican, and Menendez, who is a Democrat. And they're saying, look, we want to put these in place. They're very tough. And they will be held like a sword of Damocles over Iran's head during this 6 months. You can't use this to coast towards the bomb. If you don't hold up your end of the bargain, these new, even tougher sanctions will be in place. And I think that's the right approach.
Okay, and we got the final clip of today's programme called Iran Must Be Stopped.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
When Hitler rose to power, no one believed that he would actually do the things that he said.
You know, our history teaches us something very simple. When an enemy says he's going to annihilate you, believe him.
Iran today poses a danger that threatens to engulf the entire world in chaos.
A nuclear-armed Iran is a grave danger to the peace and security of the entire world.
Diplomacy has failed.
Will sanctions work?
If diplomacy doesn't work, the clock could run out. We've wasted years on failed diplomacy. There's no chance that Iran will be talked out of its nuclear weapons program.
Iran is believed to be expanding right now its uranium enrichment activity deep inside of a mountain bunker.
Iran has tripled the pace of production of 20% grade uranium. They're transferring their facilities underground to be immune.
Time is running out.
They're racing towards acquiring a nuclear weapon.
None of us can afford to wait much longer.
وأن تكون قنبلة ذرية إيران وباكستان قنابل ضد إسرائيل ونهتف كما هتفنا في طهران مار جبار إسرائيل مار جبار أمريكا.
For the sake of our prosperity, for the sake of our security, for the sake of our children, Iran must
stop.
Be
Iran.
Stop
now. Last time, the world was silent. This time, our voices will be heard.
Alan, it does have that era that we're living in, that 1930s era that we're facing unprecedented evil from the Islamic Republic of Iran, not only through its persecution of its Jewish community, but the persecution of Christians, other ethnic and minority groups, as well as its support for international terrorism around the world. And now it's on the verge of developing these nuclear weapons. Where are we in terms of world history?
Well, I guess what your clip is saying that we had appeasement in the 1930s and we have appeasement now. About appeasement, something very interesting was said by Henry Kissinger, the American Secretary of State in the 1970s. And Kissinger said, appeasement is the result of an inability to come to terms with a policy of unlimited objectives. When you face an adversary who has unlimited objectives, as Hitler did, it's very hard to get your head around that. It's very hard to think it's not a normal regime. It's not someone you can bargain with. So you tend to try to give them something in the hope that they'll then become the normal regime you hope they are. And of course they don't. The kinds of powers like Hitler associate bargaining with weakness. He once said of Neville Chamberlain, if that man comes back again, I'll throw him down the stairs and jump on his stomach. That was what Hitler was saying when Chamberlain went back in 1938 and said, I have peace in our time. Now, is this the same kind of regime? The Israeli Minister of Defense, Bughi Yalon, said that this is a fanatical, messianic, apocalyptical regime with the aspiration to defeat Western civilization. Now, very dramatic. If he's right or not, we ultimately don't know. It's important, though, to say it's not likely that an Iranian regime with a bomb is going to start unleashing nuclear weapons on Israel anytime soon. Israel has the ability to deter that. Certainly has the ability to deter that. So what's more dangerous, I think, more immediately is support for proxy terrorist organizations, a nuclear arms race being touched off in the region, Iranian regional dominance of the Gulf, these are the immediate problems that will flow out of the conflict.
Alan, I couldn't agree more with you on this one. But the final thing I want to discuss really is the silence of the Western media to really analyse and scrutinise this deal as well as the regime. Why has there been such little news coverage really on this interim agreement and the threat that Iran poses not only to the Saudis, the Gulf states, Israel, but also to European and ultimately British security?
There's certainly been a lot of coverage, but the character of the coverage has been worrying at times. I think there's been not a lot of work done to get beneath the surface of the Iranian regime. People call it the Rouhani smile offensive. And certainly that's been the story. The media tends to move en masse, and it defines the story pretty early on, and it sticks to it. And the story it's decided about Iran is that a new moderate Iran has emerged, and it is open to a diplomatic settlement with the West, and the West wants to avoid the kinds of wars it's been involved in recent times, which it certainly does. So we all want to see this agreement work. That's understandable, absolutely understandable, especially given the recent experiences of less than successful interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. So pursue the diplomatic solution, absolutely, but we need the media to dig a little bit lower. We need them to say, who is Rouhani? What's his background? Has he duped the international community before? 19,000 centrifuges, 3,000 of the most advanced form that go 5 times faster than the older form of centrifuges. The ability to dash from where they are now to having the bomb is a matter of months. It is a regime which has breathed hostility to the West, which supports terrorism, supports proxy terrorist organizations around the world. This is serious. They must be stopped.
Professor Alan Johnson from BICOM, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. And I want to thank you all for watching this programme. As you see that we're facing incredible dangers, and this new interim agreement between the Western powers and Iran is troubling because it does not stop Iran's nuclear weapons programme, just merely halts them. So we have to make sure that we keep our leaders to account, that they do everything within their power to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons so that we can secure a peaceful and stable Middle East. And this song is dedicated to the people of Iran that have to suffer under horrendous conditions under a very evil regime. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
Your time is fleeting, our hearts are beating. Though you may shoot, our stones are cast, and once you fall, so does the past. Oh, old man, wake and see, it's your own face you destroy. We're born speechless but free, and now we found our voice. We are not alone. This struggle knows no lines. We are fighting for our home. A fight as old as time. Old man, wake and see, it's your own face you destroy. We are born speechless but free, and now we found our voice. Standing here with the light on, not knowing if what I see is true. Still I know I must fight on. Every step I take is 'cause I'm moved These halls are shaking, its walls are breaking, though they may try to crack my bones. This blood they spill is running home.